Welcome to everybody just joining us now. We're just waiting for everybody to make their way in from the waiting room, and we'll begin very shortly. All right, so while we're waiting, I'm just going to take care of a few housekeeping items. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today for our virtual talk. We're very excited. If I could remind you to please keep yourselves muted throughout the presentation, unless prompted for discussion questions, then of course, we'd love for you to unmute yourselves and chime in. And if you have any questions otherwise during the presentation, feel free to type them into the chat or question box at the bottom of your screen. And our speakers will be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of the program. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. And you can also use the questions or comments section on Facebook Live to ask questions. We'll be monitoring those and answering those at the end of the program as well. I do want to note that this talk is being recorded and streamed live, and it will be posted to our social media channels once the talk is over. If you would like to rewatch this talk or watch previous virtual tours and talks, please check out our YouTube and our Facebook pages. And with that, I am excited to introduce our speakers to you, Jerry and Barbara. This talk is entitled The Men of the Timken. So thank you so much to you, Jerry and Barbara, and I'll hand it over to you guys.
Thank you, Blythe. We're really looking forward to this morning, and I want to thank everyone for joining us to look at a few of the portraits of men at the Timken Museum. First of all, however, I wanted to say great news. The Timken Museum is reopening to the public on June 8th. So we're really excited to be able to get back in the museum and see the portraits in person once again. And I encourage everyone that can to do so. Remember, the Timken is the only free museum in Balboa Park, and it has just exquisite art. I really encourage you to visit now that we will be able to again, and it will be all fresh and new and reorganized. So we're thrilled to be able to go back in. Now, admittedly, female portraits usually create the most excitement and discussion in a museum. It seems there's so much to talk about: the fabulous dresses, the hairstyles, the jewels or the lack thereof, the expression on their faces. Are they grumpy? Are they happy? Are they downtrodden? What's going on? But in reality, the men, even though those portraits seem quieter sometimes, if you look at them closely, there's actually just as much going on. So what we're going to do today is look at some of those portraits and compare them to see what differences happen to men's portraits when they come from different areas, different political climates, and different geographic climates, and of course, different periods in time. On this title slide, you see a picture by Peter Paul Rubens, who lived from 1577 to 1640, and who, of course, is known for his celebration of Baroque, exuberant use of color and robust women, among other things. Rubens grew up in what was the Spanish Netherlands with a really good education. He spent time at the court in Brussels. He knew languages, and then he traveled to Italy and enmeshed himself in the political and artistic world at the time. At one point, he was the most famous artist in Italy, even though he was from Amsterdam. He went back to Amsterdam and became first painter to the king and created a large artistic school that became the design of art schools going forward and really became an engine for Renaissance art. Now, this painting that he created, a portrait of a young man in armor, is actually what is called a trony. A trony is not exactly a portrait. It's a painting of an interesting face. So as artists were doing their work and going about their daily lives in the general public, when they saw people that they thought had interesting faces or a look that they were hoping to capture, they would paint a quick portrait and keep it in their studio as an example of something they could use going forward. So perhaps when they were creating large military scenes or banquet scenes or whatever, they had a cache of interesting faces and bodies to use. And that's what this painting is. If you look at it pretty closely, you'll see that the artist spent really the most care on the face and the head of the subject. The background is just kind of lightly painted in. The robe, of course, is beautiful and the armor well drawn, but the real care went into the face so that you could see this kind of arrogant young man with those curls rioting over his head. So this is something that Rubens would have kept in his studio, perhaps pinned up on the wall to remind him of a type of a person that he could use going forward. So that is what is a trony. Now, moving on to the actual representation of specific people, you may remember that the Timken Museum has one of the largest collections of icons on the West Coast. The original family that created this wonderful art collection, the Putnam family, had three very well-educated daughters, one of whom was a Russian scholar, and they had established connections throughout the Russian community across the United States and into Europe. And when the Bolshevik Revolution happened and the art pieces were all stripped from the Russian churches, they were able to make connections with some of those art dealers and friends and acquire a great number of these wonderful icons. And let's move to the first slide, please, Blythe. Here we have the most powerful of the saints, the Archangel Michael, who is pictured announcing the second coming, the end of the world, the end of time. He is pictured as an angelic Russian warrior leading basically the army of God into battle against the forces of evil on a fierce winged red horse. You can see, and he has those great golden wings with a holy fire between them. In his left hand, he has a huge trumpet with a censer at the end of it, spreading incense across the world and across the universe. In his right hand, he has the Holy Book of God with also a sword. You can see that sword has a cross at the end of it, and the sword is going all the way down the picture into the body of Satan, who is being trampled at the base of the picture by the hooves of that red horse. The mighty sea, which is roiling, is swallowing all the buildings in the world, and particularly the city of Babylon, which is sinking into the depths. This is an amazing picture. There's a lot going on in this picture. Those two pictures at the top. On the left, you see a celebration of the feast day of Michael, which is November 8th. And on the right, celebrating the miracle of the archangel, in which he caused a spring to flow, which supposedly cured a young mute girl. Now, when my son was much, much younger, he had a terrible time sleeping and had horrible nightmares. And one time we went on vacation to New Orleans, and you might know that in the French Quarter in New Orleans, there's a cathedral, a beautiful St. Louis Cathedral, and they had a little gift shop. And so I went in and bought a little St. Michael medal and brought it home and gave it to my son, who was, I don't know, 6 or 7 at the time. And I said, no, this is St. Michael. He's God's warrior against the devil and against evil, and he will protect you. So he would wear that while he slept. And it really did help his nightmares. It was amazing. It was great. Now, after this, by the end of the 15th century, icon writing started to focus on the lives of the saints rather than parables and stories. Let's move to the next slide, please, Blythe. This style, which focused on one particular saint and then talked about his life, is shown here with this gorgeous icon of Saint Basil, created in the 16th century at the Moscow School. This large icon, this is a really large icon, more than 4.5 feet by 2 2/3 feet. The gold background and those white vestments really make it stand out and grab your attention as you walk by. You might also notice the red color and used in many of the vestments in the pictures surrounding St. Basil. That color is predominantly used in icons from the Moscow school. They had a mineral around that area that was enabled them to create this color. So whenever you see that color, the icon is quite frequently from the Moscow School of Writing. Now, St. Basil was a bishop and doctor of the Eastern Orthodox Church in the early 4th century, about the year 300, 330, thereabouts. He was a prolific writer and a spiritual interpreter of the Bible, and had a tremendous following and a great deal of ecclesiastical power. When named the Archbishop of Cappadocia, he founded a hospice, including a cathedral and monasteries and buildings designated for the poor and for the ill. He really founded a sect to care for the needy going forward. In this icon, there are 2 roundels over his shoulders, one with Jesus Christ and the other, the Mother of God. In his left hand, he holds the Bible, the Word of God, and his right hand is raised with 2 fingers, giving the duality of Jesus Christ and God. He's surrounded by 14 other pictures, all from important events in his life. Those pictures are really well done. They're not terribly busy. This is a really beautiful icon telling the story of St. Basil's life. Now let's look at these 2 icons side by side. You will see, thank you. You will see that both were created close to Moscow. The St. Michael in a small town called Paleke. And you can see the differences that time has wrought. The 16th century icon of St. Basil is much more Byzantine. The figures are flatter, kind of one-dimensional, although the colors kind of pop them out and garner your attention. They're much less human looking. They're more flat and less natural looking. Comparatively, St. Michael, the icon that was much more modern, done actually in the 19th century, even though he's wearing a really interesting military Russian uniform, you'll see that his body is kind of rounder. You can see muscles, and in Satan at the bottom of the picture, his body also much rounder, much more human. The horse has a very fierce expression. There's a very strong movement toward modernism on the St. Michael icon, which is kind of interesting, even though theoretically icons were supposed to be the same and be copied exactly. Now, however, let's move to looking at a more human picture. Here we have St. Francis in meditation, done by Francisco de Zuberon in Spain around 1635. Excuse me. Francisco de Zuberon live covered the period during which Spain was warring basically with the rest of Europe over control of the very wealthy Flemish Netherlandish area, and during a long, bloody religious war between Catholicism and the new Protestant sects breakaway. Zuberon remained in Spain for his entire career and was basically a cork painter who was commissioned by various orders to create paintings for the orders. He had apparently more than 20 commissions each from the Mendicant order and also from the Franciscan order. So it garnered him a reputation for being a religious painter in the main. Here we see St. Francis deeply in prayer, with his face illuminated. So this again is another large painting, about 37 inches by 27 inches, set in kind of a vertical style, with the picture occupying the entire frame, top to bottom. It was probably commissioned by an order, most likely the Capuchin monks, which has that style of vestment. They are a smaller sect within the Franciscan order, defined by extreme poverty, austerity, and simplicity. This robe, the Capuchin style, is defined by that cowl that points up. It supposedly points the path to heaven, I'm told. And St. Francis, of course, started life as a young man, from a very wealthy family, a bon vivant around town, having a wild time, entered the army and had a vision that turned him away from that lifestyle and into poverty and giving up everything that he owned. He actually even sold some of his father's silks and tried to give the money to the church, which the church wouldn't take since he was not authorized to sell those silks. But he was thrown out of the family for that and disinherited. He apparently was brought before the bishop on charges. He reportedly stripped and walked away from everything and went to help the poor in Assisi, the city for whom he is known, St. Francis of Assisi. He then gathered knowledge for his kindness to animals and the ill. He created new religious orders that were authorized by the Pope eventually, and became one of the most revered saints in the Catholic religion. Here we see him. First of all, this painting was acquired by the museum on its 50th anniversary in 2015 to celebrate the anniversary of the museum. And here you see St. Francis again, deep in meditation, mouth slightly open with light shining from the left, and that path of light going up through the end of the cowl. His robe, if you look at it closely, appears to be very stiff, and it looks like it's been pieced together in the middle with two different colors, perhaps an oilcloth even type of fabric, it looks like. This detail and texture in the way the folds of the robe can be seen speaks to Zurbarán's skill at draperies, for which he is also well known. Now, held softly in St. Francis's hands is a skull, which is a memento mori, a reminder to us and the monks viewing the painting of the brevity of life and the impermanence of man on the earth. This painting shows the complete submission of this man to his belief and the reminder that sanctity and poverty and honoring God are the intentions of the order of this group of monks. This would be a great reminder to those monks as they walk by this painting every day. Now let's move to another saint, Saint Bartholomew. Thank you, Life. Here we see a saint painted about the same time, but a world apart in geography and aesthetics. This is by the amazing Rembrandt van Rijn, as you can see. This is St. Bartholomew, painted about 1657, about 20 years or so after St. Francis in the prior slide. Rembrandt, of course, is the greatest Dutch artist of the 17th century, and also felt to be the greatest etcher of all time. He had a very difficult life, married in his early 20s, and had 4 children, but unfortunately, all except one of his children died, and his wife, just about a year after the birth of his last son. He supported the family by etchings, sold all over Europe at the time, but eventually descended into bankruptcy, and his son died, and he died a year after, some say from grief. Very sad story, even though now one of the most famous painters of all time. It's said of Rembrandt that he was a rule breaker, actually. Instead of painting only beautiful women, he liked to paint ordinary women, perhaps washerwomen, even old women with wrinkles and cellulite. He wanted to paint the world as it actually was. And he found by manipulating the intensity and the direction of his painting, he could create amazing emotion using dark and light. He used sometimes different methods. He used different tools other than his paintbrush, maybe even the handle of his paintbrush and his own hands, to make the emotion come through in his pictures. This painting, again, is very large and imposing. It's about 48 by 39. It's painted during, as I mentioned, during one of the most difficult times of his life. And it looks like he really poured his emotion into this painting. St. Bartholomew is one of the 12 original apostles. We don't really know much about him, although he apparently traveled Asia preaching Christianity and was apparently martyred for daring to convert the king of Armenia. He was martyred by being flayed to death, which essentially means being skinned alive, a horrible, horrible death. That is the reason for his being pictured with a knife in this picture, the tool of his martyrdom. Here we see a pensive man leaning slightly forward over the arm of a chair, holding a butcher's knife. Glowing light, again, shining on his face and hands. Looks like a cloak is developed, draped over his chair where he's leaning over that arm with his right elbow coming across. That white cuff serves to highlight that hand together with the light and points toward that knife. If you looking at the picture, you'll see that you kind of get a triangle effect going across his arm to the knife and then back up to his face where the light so brightly shines on that side of his face, which goes then back around that triangle, leading your eye around and around that picture, really looking at the skill that Rembrandt can show. Now, looking at these two pictures side by side, it's interesting because we have, if you just listen to the descriptions, you would think the pictures would be very similar. Well, in fact, they're actually quite different. You see that even though they're painted in about the same time, the two saints lived about 300 years apart, and their robes show those differences. If you look at St. Bartholomew, you'll see that his robe, the seams aren't folded in. They're very roughly stitched together and frayed, opening just to see a normal shirt collar, very, very dirty, actually, it looks, and stretched out at his neck with buttons. There's nothing really planned about this. It just appears to be some rags that St. Bartholomew has thrown on. Whereas St. Francis, now this is a planned robe with the cowl particularly pointed, even though it's been pieced together by rough fabric, the seams are folded in, as would be done a more finished garment. So it shows you the difference in the era that the gentleman lived. Both paintings are emotional, but the Zouberon painting somehow more controlled and more chaste, for which he is known, while the Rembrandt painting, turbulent emotion, barely restrained, breaking through the surface. Now, just as an interesting aside, when the Timken acquired the Rembrandt painting, it showed St. Bartholomew holding a book. Apparently, there was a squeamish owner that couldn't bear to look at the knife and had the painting overpainted with a book. Now, can you imagine someone overpainting a Rembrandt? Oh my God. Fortunately, the Timken was able to use scientific methods and X-ray it, could see the original painting below the book, and was able to restore the painting to its current glory, which, you know, bloody though it may seem, is the way the painting was intended. Interesting differences, I think, in these two painters. We have a Spaniard during the height of the Spanish military Catholicism, and the Spaniards were known for that, versus the Netherlandish movement away from the strict Catholicism, but still a great deal of uncontrolled emotion. So let's move on to some real people now, although these people, of course, the saints may have been real people, but a little bit later in time. Let's move to Guy the 17th, if we could, live. Thank you. Here we see a painting of the last of the line of the de Laval family, one of the great noble families of France. So close to the king, in fact, that the name Guy was given to all the men coming to the title of the Comte de Laval. In this case, the young man's birth name was Claude, and he was one of 5 sons, but unfortunately the only one to live. His parents were both killed when he was a young man, and he was raised by his two uncles. He was actually married at 13 to another orphan, one of his uncle's wards, a young woman about the same age. At 18, the king declared him an adult and gave him full control of his affairs, very close to the time at which this portrait was painted. In fact, we think maybe that's the reason this portrait was painted, to commemorate him coming into his majority. Now, the painter, Francois Clouet, who lived from about 1510 to about 1572, was also close to the king. His father, Jean Clouet, held the office of the groom of the bedchamber, which is probably more like chief of staff today, and official painter to the king. We're talking about Francois I of France at the time. And Francois Clouet grew up at his father's elbow and learned painting in the court, and probably actually knew the young Claude. So when Claude was named Comte de Laval, Francois was named to paint his picture, to paint his portrait. Now, this style was very typical for the aristocracy in France at the time. Very sober, kind of restrained aristocratic look on a dark background, dressed in a very rich but sober clothing, showing a serious demeanor. Remember, Guy is only about 18 at this time. Now, features at the time were painted exactly as they appeared, without flattery, which is kind of interesting. His wealth is shown in the intricate embroidery around his shoulders and down the front of his shirt, the delicate lace and the collar and the gold bosses on his hat. And there's an black ostrich feather up there too. If you have a chance to pull this picture up on your phone or on your computer, enlarge it and look at it very closely, it appears that that gold embroidery actually is circled by very tiny gold rings that follow each line of embroidery across his doublet. It's fascinating. It's difficult to see in a small picture like this, and even a challenge to see in person. But one of the advantages of being able to use our computers to enlarge the pictures and look at the detail. Now, young Claude had a problem when he came into his majority, because his estate was almost bankrupt at the time. His father had been extremely extravagant, and the family had a great many political enemies, because the de Laval family had been so powerful for so long. He was bankrupted by being forced to house a group of the king's army and feed and train the horses, etc. And at just 6 to 8 years later, after this picture, he actually died from a sudden illness. Some say he was actually assassinated. Unfortunately, at the time, his estate was bankrupt, and his young widow had to sell everything, all of her jewels and all of the furniture, to survive. So a very sad ending. The painter, however, Francois Clouet, went on to even bigger and better things. He went on to serve 4 more kings and have a glorious career in France. This was one of his earlier paintings, and he developed a little more colorful style after this, but this is a wonderfully detailed painting. Now let's move on to one that's very different. Here we have a painting by Frans Hals, Portrait of a Man. This painting just makes me smile when I see it. This is a portrait that was the most famous portrait painter in the Netherlands at the time. Hals began his professional career after he entered the Haarlem Guild of St. Luke and became a professional art restorer for the city. Of course, during this time, we've just come out of the iconoclasm caused by the schism in the church and the Protestant Reformation. And at that time, it was felt that you were worshiping false gods by looking at all the art in the Catholic churches. And in the Flemish Netherlandish area, they removed all the art from all the churches and stored them in government vaults. After a while, of course, the government went, wait a minute, there's a lot of money in those vaults. So they decided to resurrect some of that art. They gathered all the art that was deemed to be too religious and they sold it through an art dealer. But the wonderful art that remained, they had restored, and that was how Halls began his career as one of those art restorers. Of course, at that time, religious art had no more market. Nobody wanted it anymore. So that's when portraits of everyday men started to come out, and landscapes and that sort of thing. Halls was known for painting across the strata of society. He did mayors and clerks and shopkeepers and tavern owners and actors. Whoever wanted their portrait painted, he would paint them. Now, unfortunately, we don't know who this man is. We know that he was 48 years old because it says in the picture that he is 48 years old, just in the upper right corner above Franz Hall's signature and the date of the painting. But we can see that he probably was a town official of some sort. That's the typical style of dress that they wore at the time, an appropriately Protestant, sober type of doublet, although a little bit fancy in the pleating at the sleeves and those beautiful buttons down his arm and down the center of his coat. That kind of restrained ruff around his neck. We look at this man who has kind of a ruddy, florid face with thinning hair at the best and a slight Van Dyke. But look at his face, such a gentle kind of smile on that face. It's really wonderful. This is an example of Franz Hall's ability to capture an individual's internal feelings and expression in just a few brushstrokes. You'll notice that this is what we call lightly painted. Halls was known for being a master artist from the very beginning, and he didn't do heavy sketching underneath his paintings. Maybe some light rose chalk sketches and maybe a light gray or pink underwash, but he really started painting and just painted quickly through with very light brush strokes, which was very unusual at the time. It's said that he didn't paint people to death with layering paint upon layer of paint. He knew when to walk away from the picture and let the subject be captured at a personal moment. This kind of light and quick painting style was very popular at the time, although it tended to drift into obscurity as Hall aged. But when the Impressionists came into favor, they loved Franz Hals, and he became popular once again, and rightly so. You can see the humanity smiling through this portrait. So now let's look at another. Let's look at the two together. Here we see portraits painted a little more than 100 years apart, one in France and one in the Netherlands. What seems hard to believe is that Guy the 17th is only 18. Look at his serious and worried face, though. He seems almost as old as the man on the right, who we know was 48. Look at the bags under Guy's eyes. It certainly is true that they painted what was in front of them. They didn't try to make things look better. You can tell, I guess, that he's young by the lightness of his mustache, but he really looks like he has the worry of the world compared to the man on the right, who just looks happy to me. He looks like he's a nice man. He looks like somebody you'd want to know. So it's really interesting to look at the Spanish picture. Yeah, the Spanish picture on the left under an oppressive religious monarchy with war at the front, as opposed to the man on the right in an era where religious freedom is really starting to open up, although they are having, they have come out of religious wars. Things are kind of starting to calm down, and the common everyday man is starting to enjoy or be able to enjoy a better lifestyle because of the wealth of his community. Now, Barbara is going to take us through some even more opposite trends in portraiture that I hope you'll find interesting. Don't forget the Timken's opening on June 8th. Barbara?
Barbara, just make sure you unmute yourself.
How's that? Thank you. As Jerry just specified, I am going to continue and end our presentation with two more portraits of men this morning, and they will be depictive of the Rococo and the Neoclassical periods of portraiture art. And the first one, Rococo, I put here just a reminder for us of one characteristic of it that is really permeates all the portraits of the Rococo style. It stresses graceful elegance in all of their subjects. And then counteracting that, and what came after the Rococo period, is the Neoclassicism style of portraiture, displayed more gravitas and a keen sense of history. And that gravitas is like dignity, very, very formal. So now moving to the next slide. The first one that I will show here is obviously, as I already designated, one from the Rococo period. And this is a portrait of Barthélemy Jean-Claude Pupil, painted in 1729 on a very large canvas. And you can see the centimeters, which is about 15 by 42 inches. So it's also a large one that we house in the Timken collection. Now, Nicolas de Largier is the portraiteur here, or the artist, and he lived in that Rococo period, which depicts the era of the late 1600s into the early 1700s, primarily those early 1700s or early 18th century. And he, as an artist, was among the most highly esteemed and prolific portrait painters working during that era. And it was the era of Louis XIV of France. And his popularity as an artist even lasted beyond the reign of Louis XIV. And it was during this period that his portraits were admired for their deftly rendered textures and for the confident poses which lent a sense of grandeur and ease to the sitters. And we can really see this here in Barthélemy, just what, that he seems so at ease, and yet it's so grandiose what we're looking at. Now, he received, this gentleman in the painting, Barthélemy, 2 judicial appointments, and they were in Lyon after his marriage in 1722 to Marguerite de Sèvres. And her portrait, which obviously we're not depicting today, is also in our Timken Museum and usually is side by side with his. And both of them were done by Largier. Now, what I'm going to do, which is a little bit different than Jerry's, I'm going to say a little bit about each painting as we see it, but then when they're side by side, I will go into the specificity of each so we can really see the differences between Rococo and Neoclassicism side by side. So if we move to the next painting, which is the Neoclassical, what a difference. You can see it right away. And this is portrait of Cooper Penrose. And this was painted in the beginning of the next century in 1802. And those centimeters are approximately 51 inches by, about 38 inches. And so it's another large painting. And the style of portraiture here is obviously so different than the Rococo. And the artist is Jacques-Louis David. And he was another gentleman in his time that was highly sought after. And I read from art historians that David was the first French artist to unite classical subjects with linear precision and minimalist composition. He completely rejected the decorative effects of the Rococo type. And his canvases, as we can see here, he created powerful didactic works of moral clarity with few distractions or any pictorial flourishes. He is most often identified with his activities during the French Revolution, the artist is, during which he served in the National Council. So having served in that National Council during that era of the French Revolution, he was very adept politically. And when he turned to his art, that same quality enabled him to fit the needs of each patron who came to him. He knew politics, so obviously he used the positive skills of politics to adapt. And one such patron who came to him was Cooper Penrose. Cooper Penrose traveled from Ireland. He was a Quaker in Ireland who had turned more frivolous, and he wanted his portrait to be painted depicting who he was as a Quaker. So when it was then sent back to Ireland, his fellow Quakers would say, well, what were we thinking? He looks like us anyway. He's very formal in this painting. So now, Blythe, if you go to my two side by side, I'll get into the specificity and we can really see the highlighted differences here. Now on the left, obviously we already said this one of Bartolome is a Rococo painting. And the artist shows the posed figure here of Bartolome in his wig, his legal robes, and he's supporting a book. Now, the wigs at the time were worn by men of stature, and he was certainly a man of stature. His attire shows a grandiose robe, and it's a fabric with a rich reddish velvet, and it's juxtaposition with the shiny gray-black fabric that he's wearing underneath that top robe. But it's highlighted with, as we can see, has white gloves, and the white gloves have a stiff, almost like a ruffle on the top of them. And it's the same type of a starched type of collar that's a little bit more grayish that he wears around his neck. Now, in this photo, Mr. Pupil, he's holding a book which is resting upon a table. Now, if we look carefully at the book, and later on, if you enlarge the screen, you can see that there would be no title on that book. And historians believe that the goldish which is wearing on that would indicate a type of law as important as Mr. Pupil himself. There is also elegant drapery in the background, and it's perhaps in his library that he is sitting to pose for this Rococo portrait. He obviously is a gentleman with self-satisfaction here. The Rococo style of painting creates an atmosphere of self-satisfaction with an aristocratic idealism which favors intricate detailing and elaborate ornamentation. And that elaborate ornamentation is certainly depictive of what he is wearing. Now let's look to the right of this screen, and we see just the opposite. As I already said, the artist was, David did not like that Rococo style, and certainly in portraits. So he deliberately went against that, and we can see that in the painting. I already mentioned that Mr. Cooper or Cooper Penrose was a Quaker, and he wanted to have his portrait done, he sought and went after Mr. David to please paint him, and he then considered it. And this is an image of Quaker asceticism, and it's indeed what Penrose would have wished to have happened. He must have considered his own portrait a success. Few life-size portraits are less assuming. Penrose has an austere outfit or costume on. He has a black cutaway jacket, a white waistcoat, a dark gray knee breeches, and white stockings. And it's matched by the simplicity of the neoclassical armchair in which he sits, and the plain brown wall serves as a background behind him. Now, David is positioned in the lower part of the canvas, and that is traditional in the portraiture of the period, so that an open, undifferentiated space surrounds his smallish form. This has the effect of bringing Penrose down to earth, making him accessible to us and helping to establish an intimate dialogue, perhaps, between him and us. But so his portrait has none of the bombast, for example, of the one on the left of Bartolome, where his head is placed, as you can see, much higher in the composition, and the commanding form of his fills almost the entire space on the left. The starkness of the conception is matched by his execution on the left. For David, he has restrained brush work and color scheme, limiting himself to a muted palette of dark hues that's offset by brighter passages. And we can see the passages of brightness certainly in his face, his gloves, and certainly the upper part of what he is wearing. Now, the somber background enlivened in David's portrait by rough scrumbling technique here that exhibits little painting flourish. Our attention is brought instead to the object himself, Mr. Bartolome. Now, I would like us now to look at these two and think of the two periods. Jerry did an awesome job of telling us how the portraits that she showed, and certainly the two that I'm ending with, are so opposite and sometimes less than 100 years apart. Now, on the left, of course, we already said this is Rococo. And to summarize some of the characteristics of the Rococo of the early 18th century are its easygoing, lighthearted treatments, rich, delicate brushwork, sensuous coloring, and the portrait always would express graceful elegance. And certainly we see that on the left painting. On the right, characteristics in summary of neoclassical portraits would be they're more academic in style, they have more solemnity, they're highly serious, there is a clarity of form, they have more somber colors and more shallow space. Certainly, these couldn't have been better portraits to depict those two eras, and we can very easily see the difference in the two here. Now, as we move on to my next slide, Blythe, Jerry looked at several artists that came before my two. Now, art, as we all certainly know, is depicted in portraits. It's depicted in so many other paintings, in sketches, but also in other art genres, literature, music, etc. And An artist's contention, I believe, is always that of becoming a true artist, which involves a calling or a passion. And I found this quote from the James Joyce, the Irish writer from 1916, in his famous book, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And the main character in that book, and perhaps some of you have read it, his name is Stephen. And researchers believe, and I think James Joyce revealed this when he wrote it, some of himself is in that main artist, just like some of who the artists were when they lived during the periods that Jerry and I spoke of. Some of who they were and their beliefs came about through their paintings. So this quote is so pertinent. His throat ached with a desire to cry aloud, the cry of a hawk or eagle on high, to cry piercingly of his deliverance to the winds. So perhaps our artists today, we could see that they were crying out of their deliverance to the winds. And hopefully we caught a little bit of that in the winds that we assumed at the other end. Now, our concluding slide, Blythe, would merely like to thank you all for collaborating with us today. And Blythe, I would like to turn it over to you because I believe we have at least one comment in the chat room, if not more. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Let me check the chat. It's a little bit harder for me to check the chat while sharing the screen. Oh, there we got it. Is it possible that R himself painted the book over the knife, or they can say the exact time with removing the book?
So this person is asking about the St. Bartholomew.
Yes, yes, and the cover up.
Right. I can't say for sure, but I know that the Timken specialists did very exacting investigation with X-ray techniques and all kinds of other techniques. We don't know who requested it be painted over. We assume it was a prior owner because it was that way when the Timken acquired it. I would like to say that it didn't appear Rembrandt himself painted over it. The paint didn't look as old, but I can't pin that down exactly. I don't know. I'm sorry. It just seems so sacrilegious to me that anyone would have painted over any portion of a Rembrandt. I can understand why the person thought perhaps Rembrandt himself did it, but I don't believe that's true.
Yeah, it's a really interesting
Isn't
story.
It's just amazing.
Yes.
Totally changes the picture when you know it's not the saint's attribute.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I don't see you answered the second question that is in the chat now, which is the patron known who requested the knife be painted over?
Yeah, no, we don't
know.
I
think the answer to that is no, we don't know. But if anybody else has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat, or you're also welcome to unmute yourself and engage in any kind of a dialogue or discussion. I think we have a couple minutes left still, so.
Blythe, if I may make a comment, I did want to thank another Timken docent, Mona Palmer, who helped me with research, particularly on the St. Michael the Archangel icon. She is truly an incredible wealth of knowledge. And last week, actually, docent Bill Harden did a speech about a lot of the icons in which he also discussed St. Michael the Archangel. It's fascinating how many things can be seen by different people. Everybody's got a different view, and everybody's information brings so much to each work of art. It's great.
I definitely agree. I was on that presentation with Bill as well. And I mean, I see a lot of these presentations hosting them, and I see a lot of the same paintings used because they're the paintings from the Timken, but it's never the same story exactly that's being told. And everybody always has their own slightly different interpretation or slightly different, cool fun facts about the painting. And it's just a pleasure to really be able to hear everybody's perspectives.
Yeah, I agree. Everybody brings something to a painting, and there's no wrong answers.
Exactly. So if anybody has, with that, there are no wrong answers. If anybody has any comments about any of the paintings that they enjoyed seeing, or if they have any questions, feel free to chime in. We'd love to hear from you.
And remember, the Timken reopens June 8th.
Yes.
So exciting.
Well, if there are no other questions, I want to thank our docents again, Barb and Jerry, for giving us this lovely presentation. It was a great session. And I want to thank all of you who came to watch and participate with us. It's really great having you all. We'd love to be able to have given these during COVID. And I think we are going to be continuing with some monthly online presentations as well. We don't quite have that schedule pinned down yet, but we will still be doing some online presentations. And also, once the museum opens, we're going to have those in-person docent tours again too, which we're all very excited about. So I again still don't see any questions in the chat, but I see a lot of thank yous for you guys. So thank you so much. And if you enjoyed this presentation and would love to see another one, we do have another presentation next Thursday at 11 a.m. as well. And it's another docent talk. And that one is entitled Jan van Eyck, Alchemist of Art. So it's again at 11 a.m. If you'd like to join us for that, we'd love to see you there.
That'll be a good one.
Yes.
Thanks, Barbara.
Thanks,
Blythe.
Karen. And thanks,
Of course.
Blythe. Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Bye now.
Bye now.